Chapter 14, Getting Emotions on Your Side. Quote, I can feel so angry about the dumbest things. Something will set me off, and then my mind goes around and around, and after a while, I can't even remember what made me angry in the first place. End quote. Marjorie. Childhood trauma is an emotional problem. If childhood abuse, neglect, or abandonment had no impact on an individual's emotional experience, it simply wouldn't be the problem that it is. In this chapter, we will explore why people who experienced childhood harm often struggle with emotions. So, what are emotions? In one respect, this may seem like a ridiculous question. Everyone knows what emotions are. Emotions are very much a part of us, and we live with them all the time. On the other hand, emotions are a bit complex when we stop to think about it. Most definitions of emotion go something like this. An emotion is a mental state that arises spontaneously and is often accompanied by physiological changes. So, there are a few things involved in an emotional response. Something happens to trigger a response, either something in our lives or a mental event, such as a thought or a memory. There is some physical response occurring in our body, and we are mentally conscious of the reaction. Because we are aware of these physical changes, we might label or describe this emotion, i.e., quote, I'm really angry at Sally for not inviting me to the party, end quote, or, quote, I'm anxious about driving in this weather, end quote, or, quote, that movie was so sad, end quote. So, an emotion is the product of events, physiological changes happening in our bodies, and how we label or describe what's happening. Does trauma play an important role in how all of this occurs? Absolutely. As we saw in the chapter called Childhood Harm and the Body, a history of trauma directly affects how our bodies react to events. And what we describe as our emotions are intimately connected to these body-based reactions. If this feels hard to connect with, consider Reynold, a man who experienced significant physical and emotional abuse as well as abandonment. During a session late in the day, a noisy cleaner was working in the hallway outside the consulting room. Every time there was a sound, the therapist noticed that Reynold would jump, sometimes looking over his shoulder at the door behind him. His therapist said, Reynold, are you okay? You seem quite jumpy. Quote, yeah, I'm okay. This always happens. I'm just very sensitive to noises like that. End quote. Reynold was actually minimizing what a big problem this was for him. Reynold's body was automatically reacting to harmless noises in the hallway. Like many people who experience trauma, Reynold had a very sensitive startle response, meaning his body and brain react quickly to events. If he were to describe his emotions, he might use words like anxious, scared, or on edge. His body and brain are generating emotional experiences today which are directly connected to a history of past abuse. Childhood trauma is an emotional problem. As we will explore in some detail, those who experienced childhood harm got set up to struggle with emotions. If you can struggle with your emotions, this chapter will hopefully support insight, encourage self-compassion, and offer some ideas for coping. Childhood harm and emotional difficulties. Everyone can struggle with emotional difficulties from time to time. It's very human. But as we will explore, emotional difficulties can be more common and intense for many who experienced childhood harm. The way that people who experienced childhood harm relate to negative emotions is often quite different from people who did not get abused or neglected. Some can feel frightened by their own emotional lives. This was true of Pete, who was physically and sexually abused. Quote, I'm scared my anger will get out of control. I don't want to hurt people or smash up my apartment, and I don't want to go back to prison either. End quote. Others can be fearful of being afraid. The experience of threat was genuine and significant in the past. As an adult, perhaps they have had panic attacks or suffered from distressing episodes of anxiety. As a result, anxiety is not seen as a normal emotion we experience when doing something new or challenging. Anxiety is viewed as a scary emotion, an emotion which is to be avoided. Everyone can feel low in mood at times. If you weren't abused or neglected, you'll probably see feeling low as part of life's ups and downs, and you'll be confident that things will pick up. But even normal low moods can worry individuals who have experienced bouts of depression. They are scared of going through that again. Also, it's not just negative emotions that can be challenging. This may seem counterintuitive, but many people who experienced abuse or neglect don't trust positive feelings. One individual we worked with captured this issue well. Quote, when I got into art school, I was so happy for about 10 minutes, and then I just felt depressed. Actually, I felt empty. It was weird. Something good was happening. So why was I feeling so bad? End quote. As we will explore, many people who experienced childhood harm are, yet again, at a disadvantage in terms of feeling confident that they can cope with their emotional lives. Understanding and managing distressing emotions is a skill we are not born with. The skills for understanding and dealing with emotions must be learned, just like any other skill. You will note that we don't mention the emotion of shame in this chapter. This is because shame is such a significant and complex emotion that it deserves a separate chapter. What is emotion regulation? Put simply, emotion regulation is the process of understanding and responding to our emotions. It's sometimes referred to as emotion self-regulation. Emotion regulation can involve accessing emotions, often an automatic process, labeling or describing emotions, or modifying emotions. Emotion regulation is a part of everyday life. It's as common as breathing, walking, or thinking. However, it's worth looking closely at this area because there is evidence that, through no fault of their own, people who experienced childhood harm can have a genuinely difficult time with their emotions. The language used to describe emotional difficulties sounds technical, but hang in there because there are some useful ideas here. Sometimes an individual may feel overwhelmed or flooded by strong emotions like anger or fear. If this is happening, we can say that the emotions are underregulated. This just means we haven't got sufficient control over our emotions. States of underregulation can be frightening, distressing, and confusing. The individual might feel out of control, and sometimes other people can experience the person this way. Natalie spent much of her childhood between a care home and a series of foster placements which never worked out. As an adult, she can get flooded by powerful emotions, especially if she imagines she is being neglected or abandoned. Quote, Jared was talking to the waitress about his stupid motorcycle. I went to the toilet because I just wanted to kill him. On the way back to the table, I walked through an empty pool room. I felt like I wanted to scream, and I picked up a glass and walked outside and threw it at a wall, and it smashed. A car alarm went off, and I sat down and started crying, and I hated that I felt like that. End quote. At the other end of the spectrum, some individuals may overregulate. constrict or inhibit emotions. This might not happen by design, but these individuals are often cut off from their emotions, and they might feel flat or depressed. Some depressive states can be less an emotion in itself, but rather a lack of access to emotions. As a therapy group member, Glenn was often very quiet and appeared lost in a fog. During one session, he described what it feels like to have lost access to emotions, i.e., overregulation. Quote, I'm not angry, but I don't feel happy either. I used to care about things like work. I'm just sort of numb. End quote. The term emotional dysregulation is used to describe states in which emotions are either underregulated or overregulated. While over and underregulation of emotion can seem quite different, they are really two sides of the same coin. They are different ways of experiencing emotional problems, which often have roots in past experiences of threat, fear, or loss. And while individuals who experienced childhood harm can have a tendency towards being underregulated, overwhelmed by strong emotions, or overregulated, emotionally numb, it's not this clear cut. It is possible to experience either state at different times. And by discussing emotional dysregulation, we're not talking about the normal emotional ups and downs many people experience. We're talking about confusing emotional states which are genuinely unhelpful and prevent you from getting your needs met. Also, we are not suggesting that everyone is supposed to have some perfect emotional balance. Everyone can have bad days and difficult emotional states. States of emotional dysregulation are more extreme and can relate to problematic anger, immobilizing fear, depression, self harming, dangerous behavior, substance abuse, and disturbed sleep. Emotion regulation skills are simply the skills we use to understand and manage our emotional experience and all that goes with it, e.g., physical sensations, thoughts, impulses, or behavior. Why people who experienced childhood harm may struggle with emotion dysregulation. We are not born with the skills necessary for understanding and managing our emotions. We have to learn how to do this. Infants and children are highly dependent on caregivers and their family environments to learn about their emotions and the way their emotional lives connect to their self concept and relationships. People who experienced childhood harm were often at a disadvantage in learning how to cope with emotions and get their needs met. Below are 5 reasons why this can be the case. See what you can identify with. 1. Lack of a secure attachment or emotional attunement. It's normal for children to feel emotions strongly. We have all been in a shopping mall or a supermarket and witnessed a young child losing it while a parent struggles to remedy the situation. Young children are often very emotionally sensitive, whether fearful of being separated from a parent, angry at a perceived injustice, or guilty of a misdeed. But a child's mind is underdeveloped, and they have little experience of the world, so they are highly dependent on adults to help them understand and soothe distressing emotions. As mentioned earlier, a child requires at least one relationship which is affectionate, close, enduring, and safe. In other words, when infants and children experience powerful emotions such as fear, anger, or guilt, they need a secure attachment with a carer who can soothe and help them. A parent can calm and reassure their child through physical affection, comforting words, and an explanation of events. Through many such experiences, a child begins to internalize the ability to soothe and calm themselves. Along the way, they learn about distressing emotions and how to cope with them. They are also learning to trust others to help them with painful emotions. Related to the need for a secure attachment is the notion of empathic or emotional attunement. It was the Australian American psychoanalyst Hans Kohut, writing in the 1970s and 80s, who emphasized the need for empathic attunement. When a parent is empathically attuned to a child's emotional world, they understand the child's feelings and how those feelings are connected to the child's growing self concept. Empathic attunement allows the parent to validate the child's feelings. Through repeated experiences of empathic attunement by caring adults, the child develops a stable sense of self through which they can understand and trust the feelings they encounter. As an adult, they may experience criticism, rejection, or insults, but they have acquired a sense of self which can often ride it out. Many people who experienced childhood abuse or neglect did not have a secure attachment to a parent figure who consistently soothed painful emotional states or helped them understand how to cope. And they did not have a parent figure who was emotionally attuned to their experiences. As a result, the capacity to understand emotions, self soothe painful emotional states, and trust others to help can be less developed. As adults, they may be less prepared to cope with distressing circumstances and the powerful emotions that come with them. 2. Problems with emotion regulation may have started out as a way to get safety. For some children, having or expressing emotions wasn't safe. This was true for Molly, who we met earlier. She was emotionally abused and neglected by her mother. Quote, I learned pretty quickly that it wasn't a good idea to be sad or to cry. You'd get told, stop your whining, I'll give you something to cry about, or you'd get a whack. And getting angry with my mom? No way. You didn't even think of that. End quote. As an adult, Molly tended to overregulate, overcontrol her emotions. She often appears like she wants to say or do something, but she looks stuck and cut off from emotions, which should help her with self expression. However, Molly had spent her entire childhood constricting or hiding her emotions. It just wasn't safe for sadness or anger to spill out. Over the years, emotional constriction, overregulation, had been a means of survival, and today it was an automatic habit for Molly. We met John earlier, a man who had been physically and emotionally abused by an alcoholic father. He'd done a few stints in prison as a younger man for theft and assault. Quote, I was so angry when I was a kid, always getting into fights in the neighborhood or blowing up at school. I'd kick my desk over sometimes. I got suspended a lot, and I know the teachers hated me, but I was scared most of the time. That's what people didn't see. End quote. John was scared and got hurt at home. He continued to feel afraid at school and in the neighborhood, and his out of control anger was meant to protect him. This caused all sorts of problems. As an adult, fear and anger were always close to the surface and could get triggered easily. Fear and anger were under-regulated, under-controlled for John, and this caused all sorts of social and legal problems. What had started as a way to get safety in childhood had led to serious problems with emotion regulation. 3. A bad emotional education. Many people who experienced childhood harm were simply never taught how to understand and cope with emotions and related needs. In fact, many were given bad advice. Exercise 1. Emotional education. Some unhelpful instructions children can receive are below. You may have been directly or indirectly taught some of these instructions. Tick any that apply. Please pause the audio and complete exercise 1 in the guidebook. 4. Learning through observation. Back in the 1960s, psychologists came to understand that we often learn from watching others and how they get rewarded or punished. They call this form of learning modeling, and it applies to young children as well as adults. If we observe someone's behavior and notice that they are rewarded in some manner, there is a tendency for us to copy the behavior. If they are punished, we are likely to conclude that we shouldn't try to get our needs met like that. If a child grows up in a family where a parent is aggressive and appears to get what they want, they might identify with the aggressive parent and imagine they should get their emotional needs met in a similar fashion. Or perhaps a child notices that another family member is submissive in order to avoid abuse. They may copy this behavior to stay safe. Terry is a good example. Quote, "My mother was an emotional nutcase. She was always the center of attention, and if she wasn't getting what she wanted, she'd scream at everyone in the house. We were all terrified of her as kids, and my dad just wanted a quiet life. He never stood up to her, and he'd disappear a lot. I copied my dad. The problem is that I'm still doing it, and people don't respect me." End quote. Possibly due to Terry's temperament, he watched and identified with his submissive father. If he was a different sort of person, he might have identified with his mother, who got, or tried to get, her emotional needs for importance and safety met through aggression. Exercise 2. What were you taught through observation? Did you learn how to cope emotionally and get your needs met by watching significant others? If so, how did this happen? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 2 in the guidebook. 5. What did you learn about conflict? Your childhood experiences may have led you to conclusions about emotions that made sense back then, but are less helpful today. Exercise 3. What did you learn about conflict? Tick the statement below which makes emotional sense to you. Don't tick the statement which you think is a correct answer, but the statement which feels true. Please pause the audio and complete exercise 3 in the guidebook. Many people who experienced childhood harm tick the first statement because that is genuinely how they have experienced conflict. People got hurt or dominated, and the only resolution was that somebody won and somebody lost. Many simply believe that conflict must involve destructive expressions of anger, fear, and guilt. Such individuals might conclude that conflict should be avoided, or if there is conflict, they'll sure as hell have to win or limit the damage. However, conflict is a normal part of all important human relationships, and differences in opinion or needs will occur. For some people, a feature of recovery is discovering that it's possible to have conflict in ways which support understanding, resolution, compromise, and closeness. Choosing relationships with people who can manage conflict with sensitivity can be a feature of this. Exercise 4. Why might you struggle with emotion regulation? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 4 in the guidebook. 2 myths about emotions. You are welcome to agree or disagree with what follows. There are a couple of myths about emotions. The first myth is that you should always trust your emotions. Some people firmly believe this. They will say things like, "How can your emotions possibly be wrong?" It's not so much that emotions can be wrong. Sometimes we should trust our emotions and allow them to act like a good guide. However, other times emotions can be misleading or unhelpful. Saying you should always trust your emotions is like saying you should always trust people. Some people you should trust, other people you shouldn't. If emotions like fear or anger are based on a realistic appraisal of events, they can provide us with essential information and should be trusted. However, emotions like anger or fear can also be driven by past experiences of trauma and may not be realistic in our present circumstances. More about this in a moment. The second myth is that distressing emotions like fear, anger, guilt, and sadness are necessarily bad or destructive. It's understandable that people who experience childhood harm will believe that certain emotions are simply bad or harmful. Their experience of these emotions during childhood probably was bad, but emotions that feel bad can also be important and necessary, which we explore below. The value of all emotions. Humans evolved as biological and social beings, and our emotions evolved right along with us. All emotions, whether they are positive or distressing, are designed to help us in some way. Being able to experience all emotions is essential for two reasons. Emotions, one, help us understand or read a situation, and two, put us in touch with our needs and motivate us. All emotions were designed to be our friends. This can seem like an unusual idea for some people who, through traumatic experiences, may believe that certain emotions, such as anger or fear, are simply harmful or bad. Jeanette grew up in a home where domestic violence was common. Her parents got into fighting arguments, which could turn into physical abuse, and her two brothers often bullied her. Quote, I was at the recycling center, and this guy was complaining about having to pay to drop something off, and I had to get away. I went to the other end of the center, into this shop they have there, and waited until he left. I don't like anger. If someone starts raising their voice, I just react. End quote. For Jeanette, any expression of anger is scary, which is understandable. The problem for Jeanette is that she is cut off from her own feelings of anger as well. In instances where Jeanette is not being treated fairly or with respect, she can't access anger. And so she doesn't realize when she is meant to assert herself or express her needs. Anger is being overregulated or overcontrolled. The chart below explores the helpful expression of certain distressing as well as positive emotions. Please pause the audio and review chart 1 in the guidebook. So, it's important to have access to all emotions because they contain important information. However, emotions such as fear, anger, or guilt can be problematic for many people who experienced childhood harm. Fear can be so out of proportion to any actual threat, underregulated, that an individual will withdraw from others or avoid interesting opportunities. Anger can get misdirected, stuck, chronic, or out of proportion to events. Guilt can be inappropriate, excessive, or stuck, i.e., an individual may feel guilty about events they were not responsible for. Emotion regulation skills. There are many different emotion regulation skills and entire books written on this topic. What follows is just one perspective on emotion regulation skills. So, if you think this area is important for your recovery, there are plenty of additional resources. See the recommended reading section at the end of the book. States of consciousness characterized by positive feelings such as joy, pride, contentment, enthusiasm, or love don't usually require interference. Positive emotions often serve as feedback that we are on the right path and getting our needs met. The only exception to this rule might be instances where positive emotions are driven by substance abuse or behaviors which are in some way self-defeating. Emotion regulation skills are normally required when an individual finds themselves in a distressing or painful state, i.e., emotional dysregulation. In such a state, emotions can be overwhelming or out of control, underregulated, or related to numbness, depression, or alienation, overregulated. The emotion regulation skill below is trauma informed, meaning that it was designed with people in mind who experienced past abuse, neglect, or abandonment. It involves three progressive questions to help you reflect and respond to a difficult emotional state. 1. Can you label the emotion? Many people who experienced childhood harm lacked a close and safe attachment with an adult who helped them to understand and express emotions. As a result, it may not even occur to some people to consider what emotion they are feeling, and perhaps they were never encouraged to do this. Maybe no one cared about what you were feeling. If you cannot confidently name the emotions you are experiencing, it's difficult to know how to think about your situation, what you need, or what to do. Question 1 is this: can you label the emotion you are experiencing? Can you give it a name? There are a few things that may help. A. What is the situation you are encountering? B. What's happening in your body? And C. Are thoughts and impulses pushing you to act in some way? By labeling the emotion, you are slowing down and getting into your reflective or learning brain. Considering an emotional palette can be helpful. There are many examples of emotion palettes on the internet, and we have provided ours below. 1. Anger, annoyed, rage, resentment, bitterness, outrage, hostile, exasperation, frustration, vengeful. 2. Fear, anxiety, dread, nervousness, terror, panic, edginess, apprehension. 3. Sadness, grief, loss, disappointment, sorrow. 4. Depression, alienation, despair, hurt, hopeless, loneliness, gloom. 5. Guilt, remorse, regret. 6. Jealousy, relationship insecurity. 7. Envy, desire, covet, sense of lacking. 8. Dislike, contempt, hate, resentment, loathing, aversion, repugnance, disdain. 9. Disgust, revulsion, repulsion. 10. Numb, shut down, disconnected, detached, dissociated. 11. Happiness, joy, bliss, pleasure. 12. Love, affection, warmth, fondness, care. 13. Contentment, ease, comfort, relaxation. Sometimes labeling an emotion is straightforward. Bob borrowed my car without asking, and I need to drive to the shop. I'm tense all over and have thoughts and impulses to yell at Bob. Of course, that's anger, an emotion we feel in response to perceived injustice. No mystery there. However, psychologists like Leslie Greenberg have taught us that labeling an emotion can sometimes be more complex. Sometimes what we feel on the surface is not the deepest or most relevant emotion. Can you recall the example of Natalie described above? Her partner had been talking with a waitress, and she'd smashed a pint glass against a wall outside a pub. She had clearly been feeling very angry at her partner, but anger had been more of a superficial emotion she was experiencing. By slowing down and reflecting on her body and thoughts, she realized that another emotion was hiding underneath the anger. Because her partner was talking to a waitress, she was afraid that he would leave her, something which had happened many times before. Psychologists call the immediate and superficial emotions we feel secondary emotions, and the deeper feelings lying underneath, primary emotions. Sometimes the immediate emotion we are experiencing is all there is to the situation. We can identify and label that emotion, which is a good start to dealing with a state of emotional dysregulation. Other times, we need to ask ourselves, is what I'm feeling on the surface the most relevant emotion, or is there a deeper emotion I need to pay attention to? So, in labeling an emotion, using an emotional palette can be useful, and perhaps don't always take the emotion closest to the surface at face value. Ask yourself, is this the truest or deepest emotion I need to consider? 2. Is my emotional state reality based or is it trauma based? If a person experiences childhood trauma, it doesn't mean that every distressing emotion they experience is trauma based. If someone insults you or steals your phone and you experience anger, that's not necessarily because of your childhood trauma. Feeling anger or violation may well be realistic. That feeling of anger can help you understand that these situations are unfair and may motivate you to assert yourself. If you step into the road and become aware of a car coming at you quickly, experiencing fear is reality based. If your child is very sick, it makes sense to feel anxious or worried. If your dog or cat dies and you feel sadness for a while, this makes sense. However, there can be times when an emotional reaction is trauma based. If an emotion is being driven by past trauma, it may be misleading or just really out of proportion to events. Once you have labeled the emotion you are experiencing, there are a couple of questions you can ask yourself. Is this the correct emotion for this experience? And is the intensity of emotion I'm feeling proportionate to the situation? Nancy never had a safe or close attachment with her mother and was abandoned by her father when she was 5. She had a safe and healthy relationship with her partner, Sally, but periods of separation could be difficult. Quote, Sally went out to her book club, and I spent the whole evening feeling really upset. I was angry with her for going out and leaving me alone. I know it doesn't make sense, but I had these angry fantasies of ending our relationship. I was quiet when she came home, and then I was so upset I couldn't sleep. End quote. Nancy had every reason to feel reasonably secure in her relationship with Sally, but childhood experiences of abuse and abandonment were driving the emotion of anger. We met Brandon earlier, a man who was emotionally and physically abused by his mother and bullied at school. Quote, this work colleague of mine had set up a home cinema, and he invited me and a few people over to have dinner and then watch a film. I'd never been to his place. When I'm anxious, I get locked up, like I can't talk. I had a panic attack when I was waiting for the bus, and I texted him and said I had a migraine. End quote. Brandon was pretty upset with himself that he didn't make the get together. The emotion he was struggling with was clearly fear and panic. It's a new situation and an opportunity to develop friendships, something Brandon sorely needed. It's a situation many people might feel some mild anxiety about. However, Brandon's fear is really out of proportion to any threats. The intensity of emotional response was the clearest clue that past experiences of abuse and rejection are in play. So, once you have labeled the emotion, the challenge is to explore whether the emotion is reality based or trauma based. Trauma is very good at convincing you that whatever emotion you are experiencing is the truth. As Nancy sits at home while Sally is out at her book club, the idea that Sally will meet someone and leave her seems true. As Brandon waits at the bus stop, the idea that he will have nothing to say and get rejected or humiliated seems true. Assuming you are basically safe today, here is a truth that trauma doesn't want you to see. Danger was real in the past, but it's over now. In many ways, recovery is about your body and mind realizing that the danger is over. 3. How do I want to respond to this emotional state? How you respond to this question is very specific to your situation, so it requires reflection and creative thinking. At this point, hopefully you have been able to label the emotion or emotions, to give your emotional state a name. The emotional palette can help if you are struggling. And you've considered whether this emotional state is reality-based or driven by past trauma. Only you can know what to do now. If the emotional state is reality-based, the emotion can be like a good friend, providing you with guidance. Remember, evolution designed us to have emotions for very good reasons, illustrated by Chart 1. If you're scared and there is a genuine threat, find safety as quickly as possible. If you have been mistreated or are experiencing genuine injustice and feel anger, that anger is encouraging you to assert yourself. If you are sad in response to a loss, sadness is asking you to slow down, find support, or attend to yourself. What do you do if you realize your emotion is trauma-based? If your emotional response doesn't make sense or is out of proportion to events? This is complicated, and no simple answer can be provided here. In fact, much of the recovery section of the guidebook comes at this question in one manner or another. However, we will mention a couple of ideas as food for thought. The way you respond to any situation involves how you decide to think and what you are going to do. Our tools for responding include our minds and our behavior. As mentioned, what this means is specific to your situation. However, there is a general point that is true for almost every emotion which is being driven by past trauma. If an emotional reaction to a situation is trauma-based, what you are searching for can be described in one word: reassurance. If the trauma-based emotion is fear, you want reassurance that you are reasonably safe. If the trauma-based reaction is jealousy, you need reassurance that you have value too. If the trauma-based reaction is rage, you want reassurance that it will be okay. If the reaction is trauma-based guilt, you need reassurance that you are not responsible. If trauma drives numbness and you feel dead inside, you need reassurance that it's safe to feel again and start moving. So, if the emotional reaction is trauma-based, the question you are often exploring is, how do I find reassurance? How you find safety or reassurance in any situation is a big question, and we would be doing you an injustice by providing a simplistic answer here. It's a question which will get explored as we go along and from several different perspectives. However, the skill below allows you to begin bringing your creative thinking to this question. Exercise 5. 3 questions in your wallet, purse, or pocket. The emotion regulation skill we have described asks you to reflect on 3 questions in relation to a particular situation. These are: 1. Can you label the emotion? 2. Is my emotional state reality-based or is it trauma-based? 3. How do I want to respond to this emotional state? You can do this exercise in a couple of ways, and it might help to use both methods. Right now, you can think about a time when you were experiencing a difficult emotional state. If you can manage it, allow some images to come to mind of what happened and its effect on you. You can then progressively consider the 3 questions above with respect to this memory. Because you are working with a memory, you may need to rephrase the 3rd question to: how should I have responded to the emotional state? Then you can do some journaling with these 3 questions. See below. The other way to do this exercise is in real time, right in the context of your life as it's happening to you. You can write or print out the 3 questions above and keep them handy in your wallet, purse, or pocket. If something occurs and you experience a distressing emotional state, you can pull out the questions and try to work with them, doing some writing if possible. This encourages you to slow down and reflect, and can help you get out of the reactive, survival brain and into your learning brain. If you find this exercise straightforward and helpful, we are pleased. However, it's not unusual for those who experienced childhood harm to find it challenging or confusing. If this happens, we recommend that you are patient with yourself. Keep bringing the 3 questions to new situations. You will likely begin to see patterns, and these patterns can eventually encourage insight. Talk to others you trust if you can. It's a process which requires experimentation, time, and creativity. 1. Can you label the emotion? 2. Is my emotional state reality-based or is it trauma-based? 3. How do I want to respond to this emotional state? Please pause the audio and have a look at the 3 questions in the guidebook. You can do some journaling with these questions now concerning a past event, or work with them as soon as possible concerning a future event. This concludes the audio for the chapter on getting emotions on your side.